This morning was the scion exchange. I picked up a number of the varieties I was looking for. Some weren't there. I also found a couple varieties I had not specifically highlighted in my catalog search. And while we were there, Michael and I had an impulse buy at the register. We split a bundle of Bud 9 rootstock. Most of the trees in my orchard are grafted onto Antonovka rootstock. That means they will eventually grow to full-size trees that could live for tens or even hundreds of years. Not until later in my grafting experience did I even learn of the existence of dwarf rootstock like M111 and Bud 9. This rootstock will produce trees that do not live nearly as long as full-size trees, but on the plus side, they'll produce for a couple of decades once they begin fruiting, and, best of all, they are more manageable, growing to a much more manageable height and taking up far less real estate in the orchard. Most of the scion I got, I had intended to graft onto existing trees right in the orchard this May, just before the buds break and the trees blossom. But since I was able to get 5 dwarf rootstock, I'm going to take a few buds of each of the varieties I picked up at the scion exchange and try a little experiment. I'm going to graft 2 varieties onto a single rootstock. Something that's becoming more common around here, but something that is usually done on established trees right in the field. In addition to the scion and dwarf rootstock, I also picked up a few cuttings of Somerset seedless grapevine. I have half a dozen of these particular grapes already growing along the driveway, but I'd like a few more in a different location at the Nights and Weekends Homestead. I don't currently fruit prune my grapes because I want the volume, but that means I get very tiny fruit. It's still delicious, but I'd like to get some larger fruit. The best way to avoid lack of volume while being comfortable fruit pruning for fewer clusters but larger grapes per vine is to grow more vines. So, I'm going to try to root these cuttings. I've done this before with varying success. I feel like this is a worthwhile experiment because I already have these grapes, so I have nothing to lose if this doesn't work, except the time it takes to prepare the vines, and that's only about 10 minutes, all told. There's no particular reason why I couldn't just stick these cuttings into the pots as is, and, in fact, that's probably what I would do if I had these cut off my own vines. I would have pruned the vines and trimmed the cuttings for rooting to about this size. But I would like more cuttings to hopefully increase the number of vines that I can ultimately plant out this spring. Since I only really need 1 or 2 buds per cutting, I'm going to cut these roughly in half and end up with twice as many cuttings to root. When you prune grapevines and save the cuttings, there's a convention on how you cut them. The cut at the bottom, or the end that will go into the rooting medium, is cut perpendicular to the vine. The top, or the end that will eventually grow into more vine, you cut at an angle. The only reason for this is so you can tell which end is up after cutting hundreds of these out in the field. Sometimes, especially when you're cutting a lot, and if you're cut early in the season, meaning mid to late winter, it can be difficult to tell which way the vine was growing when all you have is a cutting. With these, it's not difficult because the buds have already started to swell. That means it's easy to tell which way is up. But I'm nothing if not a creature of habit. So, even though I'm not out in the field, and I'm going to stick these right into their pots, I'm going to cut using the angle convention just the same. Now that the grapes are set up to root, fingers crossed that all 6 will do so, it's time to get started on the grafting experiment. I've already gone out to the storage shed and collected my nursery pots, at least what's left of them after Michael and I grafted 300 trees a couple of weeks ago. I've got my sawdust, scion wood, rootstock, and supplies. It's getting pretty late, and I've Last night's first attempt at the experiment didn't take very long, and now that I've done one, I think I'll be able to bust out the rest of these with little trouble. I've got about 45 minutes this morning before I need to start work for the day, so let's see if I can get all 4 of the remaining trees grafted. Because I'm going to be putting 2 pieces of scion into each of these rootstocks, I'm going to be using a method called cleft grafting. This is different than whip and tongue. I've seen people cleft graft when they're top dressing an existing tree out in the field. I don't know that it would be impossible to put 2 scions onto a whip and tongue graft, but I don't think I have the skill to do it. This way, the split, or cleft, in the rootstock will help hold both pieces of scion in place. I also like cleft grafting because if you get the angle just right on the scion, you get a lot of contact between both sides of the cambium, which increases the likelihood of the graft making a union. One of the important things is to get the cuts steep enough and made at a consistent slope on the scion. This is true for whip and tongue grafts too, but here you're going to make 2 cuts instead of 1, putting an angle on both sides. With cleft grafting, it's better to open both sides of the scion so the cambium can nestle in next to the cambium of the rootstock. Also, since I'm putting 2 varieties on each of these bud 9 rootstocks, I'm going to have to do a little extra trimming to make them both fit. One thing I discovered last night when I first tried this is that it makes sense to put the labels on before putting the scion into the cleft of the rootstock. Once they're in there, I don't want to be messing up the careful alignment of the cambium layers by trying to tie a big piece of survey tape onto a tiny scion that's cheek by jowl with another scion. The only difficulty this presents is that the survey tape gets in the way when wrapping the graft with grafting tape. But I think that hassle is less annoying than the hassle of aligning everything, then knocking it off kilter when trying to tie on the labels. Once I've done my best to make sure both pieces of scion are narrow enough to fit onto the same rootstock, I use the knife to open the cleft again. With whip and tongue grafting, you can generally apply pressure with both the rootstock and scion and open your cuts enough to slide them together. But the tip of the cuts on the scion is so thin with cleft grafting that it doesn't have enough strength to push open the slice in the rootstock. Once you get one piece of scion in, it holds the cleft open for the next piece. It's just the first one that's a little tricky.